October 13, 1999, Marian, Levy.
So you'll have to tell me what you feel about graduate school, though. You were saying, so how is...
We're moving. Okay. I forget exactly on what note we ended on, but...
We were talking about history.
Okay.
In the large sense. History with the capital H. Where shall we start today?
Well, I'm interested in... I don't know that it's history in the large sense, but one of the things, when I listened to the tapes with you that I did in June, I realized... it's unique that we have this Mountain Moving Day record in front of us, because I'm interested in whether you felt that you had any special difficulties placed upon you in what you were doing by virtue of gender. It would seem traveling down in a van to conservative places with Ken and Bill, or Ken alone, you might at least superficially, seem awkward or something.
No, not so much with those guys. Those guys are pretty, have been and are great partners.
I don't mean with Ken and Bill.
Yeah.
I mean with the people you were visiting, the people you wanted.
That's true. There were some. Although I have to say that you have to remember that even though we were traveling in a van and unmarried, gender mixed group and so on, that we were going down to ask them questions about their culture, their music, their history, and their past. So there was that's where most of the discussion tended to focus, and it didn't tend to get that personal in terms of you hussy you,
yeah.
Which I'm sure some people may have felt. My experience has been, in fact, that in terms of awkwardness about being a woman, it's less whether it would have to do with Ken and Bill and me, or Ken and me being together and not being married. It's more just like that it's a very male-dominated business, and it's also the musics that we're most interested in are very male-dominated musics, at least blues and bluegrass. That's for sure the case. And so you do tend to get related to in a special kind of way because of that. Now, outside of the business aspects of things, I think that oftentimes it's more of an advantage than it is a disadvantage to be related to as female instead of as a male, because I think people tend to talk to you about a broader range of things and be more comfortable about sort of just confiding what their thoughts and feelings are in a less sort of ritualized or let me tell you my false story kind of thing. That they'll it's easier to get people to relax, both musicians or people that we might be sitting down and talking to and interviewing, that there's a broader range of relating that goes on. And it's interesting because even in this, from a business aspect, even though the record business is notoriously male-dominated, there are some ways in which it can be an advantage to be a woman because of the fact that it is so male-dominated. In fact, you can sort of, in some ways, accomplish certain things, I think, just because you're a nicer person to deal with than this sort of macho way of relating that a lot of men have, including some of whom you would think of as, fairly enlightened, liberated, meaning younger kinds of guys. But there's an awful lot of sort of ego tripping and a certain kind of pecking order. Let me show you where I am on the pecking order kind of thing that goes on, I think, more among men, and particularly if you're a woman who's fairly comfortable with yourself and fairly secure. I think that doesn't happen as often because they're not as threatened by a woman.
If you read Rooney and von Schmidt's book about the Cambridge folk scene in the early 60s, the women, this is an oral history format, the women in that talk about the scene as being oppressively male, and how sometimes it affected them. But I guess you were You weren't really part of that scene. You did.
No,
You arrived
this
later
was
on.
this was
and,
after this was
and
after
Rounder
that.
was going later.
This
yeah.
was after that, and this is also, I think, more importantly, after the radical political era. I mean, that was a very apolitical scene. Now, a lot of women have written about SDS and about the New Left as being very oppressively male, and certainly it was male-dominated. But on the other hand, the women's movement came out of that, so there already was an emerging consciousness by the time that we were living together in our communal situations and starting Rounder. And frankly, as I say, I think that Ken and Bill were and are, both of them, pretty good about dealing with women as peers and colleagues, more than maybe some of the more sort of quote-unquote artistic egos of, say, the folk revival years, where they really wanted to have their chick to look after things and so on. And in fact, there were a lot of times that Ken and Bill, which is another form of I don't know, not male chauvinism, but certainly male-defined ways of looking at the world, that they would sort of challenge me to do certain things that was more their way of doing things, and that I didn't necessarily want to do or feel comfortable doing, like just, you've got to work harder, you have to put in 70 hours a week or something like that. And frankly, I've always loved reading and walking and going to libraries and bookstores, and it would be like, well, geez, or which I did for a number of years, going up to Maine and staying there 4 days a week in western Maine in the mountains and working in the warehouse. 4 days a week, and then being up there 3 days a week, which I did for about 4 years, I think, until I sold that house.
In what period of time?
This would have been the first half of the 80s.
Okay.
Up until around 84, something like that. 82, 83, 84.
What was it like in terms of the workload at Rounder in, say, 75 or 76, that you were now, you might have still called it a hobby, but you were a label. You were but you still hadn't gone beyond the collective mentality, and you
to start, to start with Mountain Moving Day, since they have reprinted in the back there our little statement that we used as a record company operating as a collective.
Right.
To me, the demarcation was when we started hiring employees, and when we first rented a warehouse, as opposed to what we did up until 1974, which was operating out of our own apartment, and then the house that that Ken still owns on Willow Avenue. And that was the time that we really still could, and I say this with all due respect to ourselves, but could delude ourselves that we were functioning as as a collective. Part of the reason that we did is because nobody else really wanted to sort of commit themselves as wholeheartedly or one-dimensionally to just being a record company, as the three of us and nobody else of the people that we sort of tried to recruit to become parts of the collective, which we did for a lot of the first 4 years, shared exactly the same vision of the music. In fact, a lot of them would have been people like the women in the women's liberation rock bands who had, for example, there was a real split. There were the people who were doing it because politically they were in sympathy with our values and goals, or there were people who might be interested in the music but didn't share the political goals.
Right.
And we just never found people, frankly, who combined that in the same way that we did, and who therefore shared enough of a common vision and a sense of a common vision and common goals. And of course, over the past, it's nearly 30 years now, that evolves, and yet somehow or another we've still managed to have enough of a sense of common goals and common vision of how we see the company. I think that right now we're in fact, a real transitional period, a real sort of challenging time in terms of its being a test to our partnerships. And I don't mean partnership in the sense of one-third, one-third, one-third. I just mean in terms of how we, as the partners who own the company, see it going forward, because I think that we're now old enough to realize the positive aspects of what we've done and of what we've created, but there are differing perspectives about things that we've done wrong, and how to fix that going forward. This is a very challenging time in the whole record industry. So we're at a very pivotal point in the growth of our company. And so I think, and we're also at a very pivotal point in terms of where the three of us are in our lives now, because Ken and Bill were always much more, I mean, you could call it a workaholic, and I don't mean it necessarily in a negative way. I just mean that they have always been much more identified with their work and with the company, and I think have seen it much more as an extension of themselves. And whether it's my style of, as I've realized, in being a mother or not, that contributes to this, I don't know. But whereas I have tended to see Rounder as more of a separate thing that we've created, and I'm much more concerned about its growth and health as a thing unto itself, as opposed to as an extension of myself or as an expression of who I am. So I think that it'll be interesting to see, because the reason that we do have a lot of decisions that we'll have to make in the next 2 or 3 years is that the record industry has changed so much. And so to a large degree, in order for any company of our size to maintain its presence, you have to grow, or else you have to be satisfied to become smaller, like, for example, our Hulu. And it'll be interesting to see how all of those tensions get played out, the decisions that get made. Because I think it's the first time in our history that we can't just go from the gut. We always did things, and Bill, of course, is the person who was more involved with the legal and financial end of things, would say this less than Ken and me. But I think that for the most part, even he would agree that we have been remarkably successful at being able to have a company grow by our instincts, as opposed to having to pay attention to the laws of how companies grow. And how do you grow your company? You know, in terms of the economics, the finances, the legal picture, and all of that. And that's unfortunately what you have to do in this day and age, I think, more than ever before, to survive.
What do you see as the negative aspects of the way you've done things? And I lead off with that simply because the positives seem to me to be, certainly are more obvious to me. And I'm wondering, and we
the negatives, I believe, and I think that Bill might be more rationalizing about this than I am, but the mistakes that we have made have been purely in the realm of financial decisions and decisions in terms of partnering. It was not like we got so big for our britches. That's not it at all. It's really that the record business in 1995 and 1996 was going through such tremendous changes. And we had our own distribution company. And this is before, of course, and because, of course, the relationship with Mercury and Polygram, and now with Universal, as a part of that, as the parent company now, is the first time we've had distribution through a major label. It's the first time that we even wanted to look at that as a consideration. But part of the reason is because independent distribution was so decimated because of the retail crises of the mid-1990s. And I think we did make some mistakes in the decisions that we made, and I think we would all agree about that, but we wouldn't necessarily agree in terms of where we made mistakes along the way within those partnerships. And Ken, Bill, and I have been remarkably successful at being able to be consistent and consistently responsible partners to each other in our little triumvirate for going on 30 years. But we've been remarkably unsuccessful at doing that with anybody else, whether it's the folks at RICO or whether it's with Barney Cohen, who started Valiant, and with whom we were partners in DNA, and who ultimately wound up taking it off our shoulders when it was in a very bad state, financially speaking, and was really costing the company as well as the three of us personally in terms of just financial. It was a very stressful time financially because we made personal guarantees that Barney didn't make, he refused to make, in order to make the company happen, which we probably should not have done. And I think it's sort of as with artists in a way, in terms of artists' careers. If they've had hard times in the early years of their career, how they react to those hard times. Do they get bitter and defensive and paranoid and overprotective, or do they learn from that and continue to be willing to take the steps that are going to be best for their career? I mean, in a way, an artist with experience is the best, and a career that's at a certain level is the best kind of person to work with because they've already built a really solid base. On the other hand, they can be the worst to work with if they've learned all the wrong lessons. And I think we as a company are at that stage in our development.
Do you think your difficulties with partnering with third parties, people outside the three of you, stem from somewhere from the fundamental difference in the ethos to which you subscribe, sort of the founding principles around her, vestiges of that, of community?
You know, I don't think so. I don't think so.
It's an anti-profit collective. You're not even a non-profit collective. You're an anti-profit collective.
Yeah.
And
I would actually say that I think that that's true only to the degree that we had a penchant for hyperbole,
okay.
which some of us still has. That would appear to be, we don't give a damn about you or your point of view. This is what we want, God damn it. And so only to that degree, because I actually don't think that our political beliefs of that period, which I think that all three of us to varying degrees still subscribe to.
That being my point, of course.
But not necessarily the literal expression of it there. In other words, anti-profit. I think that in fact all of us and I think that the answer still would be no. I think that Bill might, I might be wrong about this, Bill might say yes, but I think in fact it has more to do with personality.
Okay. All right.
And by that I don't mean anything awkward about getting into people's personalities either. I simply mean that that in fact Bill, who in the past, prior to John, did a lot of our negotiating, sometimes appears to be so cautious that he in fact makes people kind of distrustful of him. And so it's those kinds of things. I think it has more to do with style, and style as business style as an expression of one's personality. The other thing is that, you know, we are one of the few companies that has succeeded to the degree that we have in the record business that hasn't wanted to be a successful record company. In other words, that wasn't our goal in life. So it's, in a way, we're almost like, if you were to look at it in terms of 20th century American history, we kind of are like our parents' generation in the sense that as a record company, we come from a scarcity background, a scarcity perspective. I think most people who start record companies, their goal is to sort of mix it up with the big boys, to get involved with the majors, to have majors fund them, to sell part of their company. Whereas for us, we want to grow the company, but we need to do it within certain parameters of protecting a business that we have built up over 30 years. So we are in a rather unique position because of that. And our needs financially, because of the infrastructure of this company, are much greater than any of the littler companies, volume-wise, who are devoted to any one or any several of the genres that are included in the Rounder catalog. So it puts us in a very, very difficult position. Some might say more a position where there's greater opportunity too, which is probably true. But it means that we are much more cautious about what direction we're going to go in, and sometimes that can be the kind of thing that would be off-putting enough to spoil a situation that in fact could have great opportunity for the company too. So it's there's an upside and a downside to it, and that's the way I tend to look at it. But that's the area in which I don't think that we've made lots of mistakes from an A&R standpoint or from a catalog standpoint. We know what we've done. It's not like every single thing is of equal quality or equal greatness or whatever. But there was a reason why we did it at the time. And it's not like it cost us, the company or other artists for the most part. And the other thing is that we occupy a different place in the record business now in terms of attracting artists, which I don't think Ken and Bill have accepted as much as I have. We don't occupy such a unique position now.
I see.
And I think that they still tend to, and they would probably say that I undervalue Rounder, and I would say that they overvalue it in the sense of what it offers an artist. But that's just the way I see it. There are a lot more companies out there now, and if an artist doesn't necessarily come to us, I don't always think it's the worst thing in the world.
Let me ask you then, moving a little bit, but you've reissued a lot of your stuff, and so why don't we, and I have
I
my
think
own
we are
thoughts.
going to be reissuing this, by the way. I
You're
think
kidding.
as part of the 30th anniversary.
I was going to ask you, why would not, we're talking again about Mountain Moving Day, and I'm wondering, lots of reasons could come to my mind just reading the literature, but I'm wondering, why would you not, or would you reissue something like this?
Again, as I said, as I was sort of implying before, we're very comfortable with our history. So looking at it is really interesting because I do see it as a real, a very fully fleshed out statement of where we were at that time.
This record
as a
is of
company,
its time. I don't know that this is a timeless document.
Right.
It's a historical.
Although it's interesting
But I
because
haven't heard the music.
even as I was looking, the music is in fact, and I think Jennifer would say this because anyone who's, it was a very raw moment. I mean, there's probably a lot more emotion in that. And in fact, I think the lyrics and the songs are a lot more interesting than probably the music in terms of having stood the test of time. But in fact, we were talking about that after, so it's interesting that Bill sent you that email because that did cause us to say, geez, maybe we should reissue that record.
Well, let's talk about this record from another perspective. It's the first record in what's
the 4,000
in what's a relatively small political series. What was the what type of discussion, if you recall, came about in terms of creating a political series?
I remember it very well because we all thought it was a great idea. And
well, first of all, was it this record or was
no? It wasn't this record. Even from the time that we were talking about starting Rounder and had our initial meetings with people like Archie Green, for example, we definitely saw ourselves as being very self-consciously a part of American leftist history and tradition. And there was a gentleman in New York who was an old leftist from the 30s named Lawrence Gellert. The late Lawrence Gellert, who died a number of years ago. And Negro Songs of Protest was a really interesting document of going back to the 30s that to us was kind of like a forerunner of what we wanted to do. Something's going on over there. I can't figure out if it's the machine or the weather.
Oh, I was wondering if there was a bird out there.
It might be.
Well.
So we envisioned all, and in fact, there being so few records in that series relatively, to me, has more to say, unfortunately, about the state of the American left than anything else, because in fact we did pursue lots of records that we would have been happy to put on this series. but there just really aren't there's not a lot of stuff available. I mean, unless you're going to look for spoken word. So we wanted to put out records that would represent, radical politics and the music from the movement going back to wherever. And it's just that there's not a lot available.
Did you solicit? How did this record come to you?
Well, actually, I can't remember whether they came to us or we came to them. I really can't remember that. Jennifer can probably remember better than I can, but my recollection was that we heard about them and went to a concert, but I may be wrong about that.
Okay, hold on 1 second. How did this 4023, if you recall, 11 songs by South Africans, how did that come to you? Or music of the Sandinista guerrillas?
In the case of Radio Freedom and the South African things, we always, Bill went to West Africa sometime in the 70s, and that's largely how that came about. In the case of things like Fred Small and Pat Scanlon, they were local artists who were doing politically conscious music.
Okay.
And
came to you?
Yeah. And Fred, in fact, had and still does have, I think, a very nice career as singing for like men's groups and playing it, in the local singer-songwriter kind of circuit.
Too bad about that damn music, isn't it? I can't stand it, that's all.
It's not my favorite either.
When was the last in this series issued? Do you know? 'Cause I'm
Actually, I would say check probably around the time of the last numbers.
Yeah.
We did more than one Fred Small record, and I wouldn't be surprised if Fred weren't one of the latter ones.
No, actually, the late 80s with a couple of things, even in the 90s. Although these might be reissues or.
Or what? Fred Small?
No, not Fred Small, but just the series itself. The last Fred Small you've got here is 1985. It's this one that we looked at, and they're not all on the show, on the shelves.
Right. What are the last ones? Probably the African ones, then?
The 1997. No, I bet these are collections. Coal Mining Woman, various artists, and Peggy Seeger, an odd collection. And, this has got to be wrong. Alison Krauss, Baby, Now That I Found You, 4601.
That's definitely. I think that you know what that is? I think that was the single from that album.
And why did it get
and because the singles have a different number, which I think is 4 or 5 something. So probably that's how that got in there. But the ones that you just mentioned.
Coal Mining Woman.
Coal Mining Woman. This is in Harlan County.
Here it is.
Come all you coal miners, and Coal Mining Women were ones that came from Hazel Dickens. Her involvement with the filmmaker Barbara Koppel, who did the movie Harlan County, USA, which is some really nice music there. And let's see, what else did we talk about? Oh, and the Peggy Seeger. Well, Peggy Seeger wrote an interesting song back when she and Ewan McCall, her late husband, wrote. Ewan in particular wrote a lot of songs from the English labor perspective, English labor movement. And Peggy wrote a song called I Want to Be an Engineer. That was an interesting sort of acoustic song in the early years of the women's movement. It's on that one that has this sort of collage kind of cover. And Peggy is, she's an interesting person, but, kind of somebody who goes back to those days of the old left.
Yeah. Yeah, now today, I wonder if you've got this new CD out in the 3000 series, and as much as I've tried, it's not a particular favorite of mine, but it might be construed as a political CD. It's by Stephen Smith. Do you know that record at all?
Yes, it's true that Pete Seeger was in fact the first person to recommend Stephen Smith to us and say that this guy is incredible and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, there are some people who are really... Stephen also is someone who, as a very charismatic singer-songwriter, although he's not one of Ken's favorites either, I don't know. I think we all have a hope that what Stephen has to say can be heard more broadly. And we'll see whether it can or not. It's only our first record with him. And he's very young. Who knows where he's going to go in future years, too.
And I don't know that it matters too much, but I notice you, and I don't know if it matters at all in terms of record stores or what have you, but I notice you don't give it a 4,000 number, you give it a 3,000 number. Is that considered in some way? Is this kind of retired, or is it reserved for a clearly movement-oriented thing?
Yes,
You've got a lot of
Chilean
things, and South African things.
The latter. Whereas Stephen, I think, ultimately hopes to succeed more in a sort of pop singer-songwriter realm.
Right. Or even, I suspect, are you familiar with Michael Hill's work, The Blues Man from the Bronx? Wonderful, wonderful political songs, really Hendrix-oriented guitar. I suspect you'd put that in bullseye if you were to record something like that, as opposed to calling it a 4,000.
Yeah. And it's partly where the artists themselves want to be, where they feel comfortable being. You know, this record, they clearly imagined themselves, conceived of this record and thought of themselves as, you know, they were political creatures first and foremost.
This is a political project. It's not make me a rock star record.
Exactly.
Did the label have, this shifting gears slightly, although I still mean to keep it sort of politically focused. Ken is proud of the fact that you've recorded so many women in bluegrass. Were there discussions about that, or an awareness of that, or did it grow slowly, or did it just happen as an offshoot of openness to music and, you know, being willing to listen to the women that were in fact playing?
I think it's more of the openness, although again, it's you know, partly that we have grown up at the same time as these people have grown up. I mean, if you look at the realm of blues, for example, it's the same, except that I think blues is a little bit ahead of bluegrass in terms of women's place in it. Partly because there is, I mean, after all, there are Ruth Browns right beside Charles Brown. There is no Minnie Monroe next to Bill Monroe, or, you know, Lester Flatt. There is no Leslie Flatt or whatever. Yes. And so I think that is something that just sort of happened over the years, just as we were fans and are fans of the old days of bluegrass. Eventually, there came to be some women who were interested in doing it also and loved the music. And I mean, I think that Allison is remarkable in that regard. I mean, she's certainly not, you know, a pure bluegrass person, but in terms of where she comes from, she's as pure as anybody else. And, I mean, as a junior fiddle champion, and then someone who grew up listening to Tony Rice and a lot of the bluegrass records that we put out, which she'd be the first to say. She's just, you know, a perfect exemplar of someone who, as long as you can imagine yourself doing something, you can do it. Because she certainly was not from a bluegrass family. She was not from the bluegrass culture. But she's just somebody who was extraordinarily talented and who didn't worry about what doors she would have to go through or, you know, might be closed to her.
Yeah, well, she was born when, in the 60s or in the 70s?
Yeah, I think early 70s.
Yeah,
I think that she was born about the time we started Rounder.
Right, I don't know that she'd... depends on your own experience, of course, and where you come from, but it's possible she didn't have the same, she just didn't have an experience of women not being able to do what they
Right,
wanted to do.
and I think that's partly because she is not from the bluegrass culture also.
Okay. Yeah. Did women in bluegrass get a sense that Rounder was a label that was sympathetic to women in bluegrass, or simply that Rounder was a label that would put out good bluegrass, period?
I think both. Definitely both. I mean, we've always been known for, not just for particular types of bluegrass, but for the breadth of bluegrass music that we put out. So no, I think it was definitely both. And, you know, the fact is we put out Hazel and Alice way early on.
Yeah.
And that was really kind of a seminal record for a lot of people, including artists like Emmylou Harris and Linda Ronstadt.
How so? Just because they were women, or for other
They
reasons?
recorded The Sweetest Gift, A Mother's Smile, because of Hazel and Alice having done it. And Hazel and Alice was one of those records that just had a much broader following in terms of people just really being knocked out by the music that was on it. So, and that was before there was really very much consciousness of I'm a woman doing bluegrass music or whatever.
Right.
So I think that therefore people could see that it wasn't just J.D. Crowe or Tony Rice that we would record.
I don't know. Hazel wasn't a kid when that record was made, was she? She was. I don't know much about her background before that in terms of professionalism or working.
No, she's an interesting. Got an interesting background actually. She's from the coal mining country of West Virginia, but she was married and lived in Baltimore, and she's not someone who was educated beyond high school, so she was always, you know, a working person, and then got involved with was heard at some sort of folk event around Baltimore by Mike and Peggy Seeger. I mean Mike and Alice, Mike Seeger and his wife at that time, Alice Gerard. And so then Hazel and Alice started doing some things together and performing at probably the first time we heard them, I would imagine, was on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And then we did the Hazel and Alice record, and then sometime after that, Ken and Hazel got involved. And Hazel is, as far as we know, a fair amount older than Ken, but she's one of those people who will never tell her age.
Okay, so Ken doesn't know her age.
Ken has never known her age. He does not to this day.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, it's a little strange.
At what point did the idea? Well, I have two questions. One I asked before, but we moved on, and it's just something I do feel I need to know, although it's kind of mechanical, and then I want to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say, you know, the year before George Thorogood, and I want to eliminate that type of transition, but let's say 76, 77. What was it like to work at Rounder? What were your days like? What was doing the stuff like for you physically? You know,
It was really not all of that. It was not really all that different. And what changed when George's success started to happen was just that there was more work to do, in the sense that we were spending more time with George on the road and stuff, and more time setting up interviews. And it was around that time that we hired a publicist, our first full-time publicist, because there was so much of that as the additional work to take on. But in terms of the look of our days, and the three of us...
Was it 13-hour days, or was it 8 hours?
No, they were, you know, they could be long days some days, but they were flexible. I mean, we usually would be at the warehouse sometime between 8:30 and 10 in the morning, and then there was a certain amount of time devoted to opening the mail back in those days.
Was that somewhat ritualized?
Yeah, it was somewhat ritualized, and then the larger the company got, the more it came to consist not so much of opening the mail, but separating the mail. What would go to the accounts payable and what would go to accounts receivable, and then what kinds of things did we need to be involved in. And a lot of listening to tapes and listening to records to just sort of make sure that they were okay in terms of the test pressing process. I think around that same time, Ken was starting to be a little bit more involved in the production phase. because it was around that time.
76,
Yeah.
roughly. Okay.
And I started being more involved in the publicity and promotion area, and Bill started being more involved in the sort of legal and financial aspects of things. So we all, up until this past year, had all of our desks in the same room. And that was true no matter what warehouse we were in. So even when we rented space over at Leechmere, all of our desks were in the same room. And that continued to be the case up until this past year.
Did you have any employees in 76? Or,
yeah,
was
we
there a
hired
number of people?
our first employees, I think, were in 74. And
Okay.
it was when we rented a little warehouse that's right up Willow Avenue, at the end of Willow Avenue, part of Somerville, that's right on the Somerville-Medford border, called Ball Square. We had a little warehouse there, and that's when we started having employees. Partly because Peter Stanfill of the Holy Modal Rounder said, geez, I think you guys are really doing a disservice to people, you know. There are lots of people who'd like to work for you, and here you are being holier than thou and saying, you know, that you're not going to have employees. Well, that's just, you know, not, and here we were thinking that we were being so great, saying that we wouldn't hire someone and exploit their labor. We were going to only work with them if they became members of the collective. And Peter kind of turned the hat around for us on that one. But so it was around 74 that we started hiring our first employees, and we needed to because the company was just growing at that rate, and we were putting out such substantial numbers of records each year that even though we weren't, you know, having a big hit a la George Thorogood, we still had so many records coming out that it was a lot of work.
How many people were on the payroll before you signed George? Give me an order. I don't expect you to know.
You know, off the top of my head, I would guess somewhere between, and this was about the same time that Scott started working for us, so there are in fact photographs of that time. But my guess is that it was somewhere close to a couple of dozen people.
That's fairly substantial.
Yeah. I would say that we probably went from a dozen people to a couple of dozen fairly quickly, from around 74 to 76.
Were all of those people simply, were the three of you kind of like the sole decision makers in terms of A&R? Okay, all of those other
we
people
always
were
have been in terms of the A&R until this past year.
And in terms of publicity, were people doing publicity and promotion, or was people basically opening mail, getting records in boxes, getting records?
No, some people were helping out with other things, and in fact, one of our first employees was somebody who did help out, did work on the production, and because with the numbers of records we were putting out, it did mean that there had to be somebody who was going to be talking to the pressing plant and the printers at least once a day, and phoning in drop shipments and things like that.
So I take it, I mean, just the mere, you know, having of employees, you know, did some damage isn't the word, but you know, it was a
challenge.
Well, no, I want to say it was a step away from the idea of a collective.
Yes.
When did that idea kind of
Right
fall by
about
the
that
wayside?
time. Right about
And
that time, I
in
would
what
say.
way? You know, did he talk about taking the you know, everything used to be signed the Rounder Collective, that used to be written on notes, used to be signed that way? Or it used to
No, we
appear
never
somewhere?
actually made a decision we're not going to do this anymore.
Mhm.
It just sort of, I think, fell by the way more than anything else, and it was perfectly obvious that, you know, if we had employees, that we couldn't really say that we're, you know, an anti-profit collective with no employees. So,
Right.
and we also, I believe, the point at which we started rethinking that had more to do with its reception rather than our saying, we don't believe this anymore. It was more that there were both artists and people buying the records who had problems with it and who really thought less of the company because of that. Oh, those rounders, it's you know, people like that. I mean, you know, they're more interested in politics than they are music. And the other thing is, there's no question, you know, in terms of the traditionally based musics, the most traditionally based, certainly not Mountain Movie Day or something like that, but in terms of bluegrass, you go around calling yourself an anti-profit collective, you're not exactly going to get Ralph Stanley or J.D. Crowe or someone on your label. The guys with patent leather shoes and the patent leather belts who want to make as much money as they can from their records.
Well, they take the profits and relieve you of the onus. It obviously didn't bother J.D. Crowe in that
Well, actually,
74.
it didn't, because we weren't putting them on there in 74, and with J.D. we did have, in fact, a very, for the time, unusual financial agreement.
Right.
In terms of being a profit sharing agreement, and we thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And it has been kind of a pain actually over the years, because it was so different from all of the others that it meant having to figure this one thing separately. And even with computers, it's difficult to have every single contract be a different kind of contract from something else. So,
but
we did it. And
rejiggered that at some point with him, right?
I can't remember how we did it, whether it is now sort of a flat fee or what, but he still does have, at least for that particular record, I think it still is pretty different from anything else. Oopsies, we better have this meeting. Ken and Bill are going to start complaining.
Okay.
Stand after 2, I lost.
We could possibly do this off tape. I want to make sure I do it before I lose each of you. Who would you talk to if you were me about Rounder? I'd like to get these names on tape so I don't lose them. And then go back 30 years to the present if you want to reconstruct. I'm doing this with everybody and trying to get some names, because the next big push, I think, for me is really needs to be to get away from here. Reviewers, people who brought music to you, people whose floors you slept on lots of times. You mentioned Alan Jabor and Joe Hickerson and Joe Wilson. Send an email out to Joe.
Probably Bill Ferris.
Bill Ferris, if I can get to him, that would be.
Yeah. Who else? We should put our thinking caps on some about that. Scott, of course.
Yeah, I'm going to try,
Did Ken suggest any particular artists?
I don't remember offhand. Let's see. Yeah, let's see what he did. Well, yeah, he said he definitely said I should talk to John Hartford. I'm not sure. Tony Trishka. One of the members of the Johnson Mountain Boys. I don't remember the names.
Dudley, probably.
He's playing off of his interests, of course.
Right.
And he talked about contexts for each of these a little bit when he did it. I'm interested in guys you mentioned yesterday, Jeff Hanisch, the guy who was so instrumental and you said would feed you people in New Orleans. And my thinking there is just a guy who can comment upon what impact he thinks
would be really good.
What impact he thinks a label had on a scene that they might have been involved in, and somebody who would know the records so well that he could know what existed before you started recording certain people. Walt Saunders was one of Ken's suggestions. Not an artist, but you don't know.
No, I wouldn't necessarily think that. Walt is one of those people who would definitely sing our praises, but he doesn't really know that much about the whole thing overall. He simply has a personal connection with Ken. And yes, he knows the really strict traditional side of bluegrass.
Oh, I wanted people who just liked you, Marian. You just have to sing your praises.
Well, why not? I might need to think about that a little bit. I would say Marcia Ball is a good one, especially since she's right in Austin. And actually, someone else would be very interesting. Carlin Major.
Carlin Major?
She's in Austin, too.
Who is that?
Carlyne Major, Majer.
Who is she?
She's a manager. At one point, she managed Maria McKee, of Lone Justice. She managed Marcia Ball when we first started working with Marcia. She managed, what's that, the Wagoneers or some other, one of those sort of alt country bands. But her husband was the owner of the original Soap Creek Saloon.
Okay, yeah.
And she's kind of she was definitely a part of the Austin music scene in terms of the growing professionalism of it. From its being a progressive country mecca during the time of Willie Nelson. So in a certain sense, she kind of grew up at the same time that we did. And in fact, she was given a very healthy buyout of Maria McKee's contract by the guy who is now the head of Interscope, Jimmy, what's his name, Iovine, who was the producer of Low Justice for a while, for Geffen, back in the days when Geffen had Maria and the band on a retainer, because, they literally paid them just to practice, and back in the time that nobody in the world ever did that. It's like, my God.
Because they just wanted this type of band.
And she was so young, she was like 15 or 16, and so they just paid her a salary for X number of years until they got around to doing the first record, which, as I recall, kind of stiffed.
They never sold very much. You mean her first solo record or the first Lone Justice record?
I think Lone Justice.
I own that record. It didn't. They never lived up to the promise.
No,
not
at all.
She's a great singer. She's a great singer.
Yeah. And Carlin is a very interesting person. She really knows music, and she was there when Soap Creek was, having all of everybody from Buddy Guy and stuff. So she had a real connection with the kind of music that we liked. And she was a manager of an artist who we do and did think very highly of. And so she knew us at a certain point in our career in the growth of Rounder. So, and she's an interesting person because she does have a broader, I'm not saying she knew us as a company all that well, but she would have an interesting perspective on it.
When did you record Marcia? I know you did her last album, but I thought prior to that her stuff was on Antones.
No. That was Angela Straley.
Okay.
No, we've done all of Marcia's records. All of them. Literally, she's been with us for her entire recording career, except for one record on Capitol that was out of print for ages and ages.
Okay.
Yeah. That was what was it
I guess
called?
it was
Circuit Queen.
I guess it was Angela Straley and Luann Barton did Antones. I'm lumping them together.
And that were on Antones, and Luann was on Electra.
Okay.
With Jerry Wexler producing. During her brief fling with Jerry Wexler. Jerry Wexler is another person to talk to about us also. And I do have his phone number and address. In fact, I have owed him a phone call for a very long time.
Why do you say that? What's the, I know that
he's just a real sweet guy, and he's been really happy that we've done records with all sorts of people, from Ruth Brown and Charles Brown to the reissue of the Etta James record that, I can't remember if he produced it or not, but anyhow, it was one that was really largely overlooked. It was a very good record that we reissued from Warner's. So he just has known a lot of our records going back for a long time.
Is he the kind of guy who's so business savvy and been talked to so much that he's not going to say anything with the tape running that isn't, laudatory?
No, not at all, because of course he's very old now. So he has no stake in anything. He's been retired for a very long time, and in fact, his book, whatever it's called, The Life in American Music, which I think was with David Ritz, the guy who has done so far Etta James, Ray Charles, and now the new Aretha Franklin. He wrote that with, he wrote Aretha, can you believe it? He wrote Aretha Franklin's autobiography.
That's right, I know.
So, as they keep calling it, as all the shows that she's on. But no, Jerry is not, he's not at all a political kind of person, and he's never been hesitant about sending us someone if he thought they would fit with what we're doing. And no, he's just you should read that book, because he is a very articulate guy, and he's an interesting guy. He's kind of very typical of the generation of producers and record guys the generation before us.
Who were some former Rounder artists who you wish were still Rounder artists but chose not to be?
And George.
George Thorogood, okay.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess that's, he had opportunities.
I'm speaking for myself. I don't think that Ken necessarily feels that way. You can ask him, but
Right.
I certainly feel that way.
Okay. And he had obvious other opportunities in terms.
Well, and I mean, I think he made the wrong choice in this last case. I mean, he never actually even gave us an opportunity to make him an offer. He signed with a company, I can't even remember, it's like SRG or something. That's a bunch of 70s rock dinosaurs, basically, which I think, George has always been a quintessentially independent artist, and so his manager, such as he is not really a manager. He's more like a friend who will do George's bidding. And I'm sure he just said, well, we have a good offer here, so let's take it. After mulling this over for ages and ages, because in fact his contract was up with EMI about the same time as one of the buyouts or mergers or something like that anyhow. So, and he did look around a little bit. And I say that even though I don't think that George's music it certainly doesn't sound as fresh now as when we started recording him in the late 70s, but he's just someone whose music we've always liked, and therefore we would be perfectly happy to continue putting out records by him.
No one else?
Actually, there aren't a lot, as far as I'm concerned, that there are a lot of people, actually, that I would like to do records with who've never been on Rounder.
Who are some of those?
Actually, I once used to have a whole envelope full of
Buddy
names
Guy
like
and B.B. King. Well, these are
No, not B.B.
Okay.
Not B.B. I wouldn't want to work with his manager.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Buddy Guy in a heartbeat. Robert Cray, who we did try to do Cray's last record. But
these are softballs. I want to know with whom did you lock horns and why?
Well, we locked horns with Robert Cray's manager. I mean, he's a guy we locked horns with going back to the late 70s with George Thorogood, because Mike Kappas of the Rosebud Agency is someone that I don't know a single woman in the business who has ever not locked horns with Mike Kappas. But in the case of Rounder and Mike Kappas, he locked horns with all of us. And it's because we were a threat to him, to his ambition to become George's manager. George did not want a manager and has never had a manager probably be better off in some ways if he had, but he's never had a manager as the industry envisions a manager. Instead, he's always had a friend or something like that who basically does his bidding. And we worked with him in making a lot of what would be considered management decisions because of his lack of a manager at that time. And Mike Kappas really wanted to manage George. Ultimately, George left him for that reason, and even for booking, because that was what the relationship was. George was with the Rosebud Agency as a booking agency from not just the whole time we were working with him, but even beyond that. So there's no question that there are Rosebud acts we would have liked to work with also.
Who have you had to drop for you just couldn't do it. You couldn't get any decent return on the record. It just didn't work, and you wish you could have recorded for artistic reasons, but you just couldn't. Any acts that you just lost?
Well, there are a lot of black acts that I feel that way about on Bullseye. Yeah, for example, even since you're from Austin, the most recent Omar record called Swingland or Swingtown or something like that came out on Blacktop is one that I would have liked to have done, but they spent a fair amount of money on it, and I knew how much we would sell, and I liked that. But there are a lot of black artists, including a lot of black Texas artists, that I would like to do, like Joe Hughes. We did one record with him, partly because it was recorded in Europe, and the guy who's our partner in Europe kind of prevailed upon us to put the record out, and so we did. But we don't do very well, unfortunately. With right now, the blues market is so saturated, and I'm sure Ken would tell you the same kinds of stories about bluegrass acts too. Although Ken tends to work his way around to never saying no to anyone until he feels sort of forced into it, so maybe he doesn't feel as much regret. And when I say regret, I mean it's just, unfortunately, I don't think it's their fault, and I also don't think it's our fault. I think it's just that, unfortunately, at various times, it's a combination of the market being too saturated and the fact that we aren't dealing with mainstream music. And we're very well aware of that, even though sometimes the artists aren't.
You take one of my favorites that you don't record, the Holmes Brothers. Why don't you record the Holmes Brothers anymore?
Well, now that was more.
I love those records.
We all made
especially,
that.
Of course, the first one. You know.
We all made that decision, but Scott, I think, felt that they're a very good example, actually, of an act that did really well critically for the first record or for the first couple of records, but never really built up a good enough touring base outside. I mean, they never built up much of a base, even though they toured a lot. They never really built up that much of a base through in the kind of the blues hardcore area, and they never broke through to any place else. So I think that Scott felt as much, although he kept being, sort of not being able to say no to their booking agent and manager, but he kind of felt that the story had been told, and we were experiencing diminishing sales. I think that they're an act that we probably could have done more records with if, as I say, they had built up more of a following with the sort of the Blues Club and Blues Society kind of circuit, but for some reason they never actually did.
Bobby King and Terry Evans, and I'm picking my own favorites.
Bobby
so
King and Terry Evans, if it weren't for a connection, I forget management-wise who the connection was, but anyhow, it was a very overpriced record. It was virtually, there was no way that we could have really done any career development given how expensive the record was to record.